When I transitioned to a sales career roughly 4 years ago from a different career altogether, I said some things that were honestly laughable and horrible when I first started. So if you're breaking into tech sales, maybe you're in sales looking to get some perspective, trying to find your voice, or you have no sales experience altogether and you're trying to understand how to sell without selling, I want to give you 4 things that have particularly helped me progress my career and get away from sounding like that horrible salesperson, having started from zero myself. The big thing that I would reiterate to you, I reiterate to the students that I coach in my Tech Sales Bootcamp, Tech Sales Ascension, is that you have to apply this to the real world. This is absolutely going to be a great help for you, but if you're trying to break into tech sales as an example, can you message someone and ask them for 15 minutes of their time or a coffee, or ask them how they broke into the company that they're working at, which is the one that you want to work at? You don't have to be in a direct sales role to actually get sales experience. And maybe you don't want to go that formal sales route. You're trying to start a company, whatever it might be. You can do a sales-like activity by asking mentors in your space or business owners that are ahead of you for their time, for their perspective, right? So again, just reiterating before we dive into it, get experience. You don't have to have a sales job to get sales adjacent experience and actually start practicing these things and iterating along the way. And this first major point, again, this video is not going to turn into a mindset video, but I'll tell you, having been someone that was on the fence, that debated going into sales for a long time, you need to fundamentally accept that sales is a necessary part of every business. And because of this, what this helps you do over time is get over the fear of cold calling, get over this worry that you're interrupting someone's day. Again, when you're cold calling, when someone picks up, you're gonna get hung up on. It is what it is. But there's also a lot of people, when you catch them at the right time, or you're starting to ask questions about the things that are most important to them, I'm not gonna say they're glad that you called, but they're willing to take a conversation. And again, if that call goes well, they're willing to learn more. They're willing to look into your company's product. So you have to get in the mindset, again, coming from someone that was too timid when I started, you have to understand if you're gonna do sales, this is a non-negotiable. Sales is a part of business. You are not inconveniencing anyone's day. You are there to try and solve their problems. And that is gonna give you the mindset to stick through the early part where you probably don't do that well, which leads me to my second point, which is if you're selling something, again, I'm coming from this highly technical B2B tech sales world, you have to know everything about your product, and that is a non-negotiable. And I see this because there's people maybe without tech backgrounds, or I'm sure if you're in sales in a different career, there's people who kind of, don't really put in the time and effort to understand everything about the product. And it's not that you have to know everything about the product so you can tell a prospect every little detail, but you'll realize when you get people on the phone, you've accepted that sales is a necessary part of business. You have the wherewithal and fortitude to keep making calls and stick with failing. Well, as you start to fail, you probably realize that you're not able to have genuine conversations because you don't know your product well enough. And I will say, this is a necessary step. It's not like once you know the product, you're going to be great. Because the thing that I see often, again, from people I coach, from coworkers I've worked with in the past, is you realize you need to learn more about the product. And then as you do that, what happens is when you make a cold call and someone says, yeah, we need a scalable feature, or they say something that sounds like a feature of your product, you then are so excited that you remember that feature that you go and immediately pitch when you otherwise should ask more questions, when you should really understand if that feature is actually important or that's something that they just think they need. Maybe they're thinking out loud and it's not actually that serious, which again, as we've started to make the necessary effort to keep calling, we understand sales is a necessary part. We've really started to study our product and we're having better conversations, but we're not always hitting the mark. We're not always getting prospects totally interested in what we're selling. This leads me to my third point, which is you really have to understand and be able to ask intelligent questions that are relevant to the customer and that are open-ended. And again, this is not something new if you've experienced sales, but I want to give you some real world examples of how this plays out. Because again, you know your product, but now you get in this pigeonhole where you're talking to someone and they mention something that sounds like a feature of your product and you immediately go and pitch. And you do that and they don't take a phone call and you're left watching the recording and you're like, why didn't they take it? You start to understand you probably should have asked more questions, right? So when they say they need a feature that scales or they need this specific feature, if that's something your product does, that's great. Well, why do they need that? Why is that important? It sounds like this is a newer initiative, right? Is this something that's always been pressing for you or something new that's popped up? There's tons of questions you can ask, but in doing so, you really get the prospect to help you understand what a problem that is. Because I can't tell you how many times I've made this mistake myself. I see this all the time in other reps where they get so focused on one feature And if they actually asked a few more questions, they realized that maybe that's kind of important, but in reality, they're actually way more excited about this specific feature set. But because you immediately went into the pitch, because you didn't take the time to ask more questions, you didn't get enough information to make that meeting with the team, to set up that opportunity further, because you just jumped the gun and went immediately into pitching. So by asking more questions, because you've already studied your product so much now, you're actually starting to see in these interactions now how your prospect actually thinks about the problems that you solve and would think about your product in a conversation. And so then you're starting to learn to ask more open-ended questions, right? And the negative side, and what I've seen actually in some of the people that I coach directly, is I've listened to cold calls before where someone really starts to incorporate really great questions. And just like with the products in the past where they learned about enough features to where they got really excited when they heard something that aligned well to a feature and they started pitching, now you've gone beyond that, you're starting to get better, you're starting to ask more questions. But I've also seen where you get so excited that a prospect is actually talking to you and keeps talking that you keep asking questions and you forget that the original purpose of your call was to set up a meeting in the first place, or maybe even close a deal if you're in transactional sales, right? And so all that to say, again, this is the progression. You accept that you're probably not going to be that great when you start, and you keep doing it because it's a necessary part of business. You understand everything about the product, and you're starting to have better conversations. You're starting to understand how what your company says is valuable and how a prospect actually thinks about that. You're able to drive a conversation that hits on both of those. And then again, you're starting to learn how to ask better questions, to go deeper into someone's use case, to better understand their world, the true problems that are keeping them up at night, etc. And it really ties into now, which I think is the most important, you have to go through this progression. But the last and most important is now you've done this, you've struggled a lot, you've made a lot of mistakes along the way. But now when you're calling, you're very clear on your end goal, which again, in the case of an SDR, is to set up that meeting with the team, create an opportunity. If you're doing some different sales, maybe you're an entrepreneur, it might be to actually close a sale on the phone, right? But whatever it is, that is the last and most important piece of this. Once you've struggled through those earlier steps, is you have to have a clear end goal in mind. Because you've gone through the muscle memory of all the steps prior, now when you're coming into a call, you have the wherewithal when maybe you pitch immediately, you realize that, and that's okay, and you steer the conversation back out to more questions about their world before fully pitching the product. And again, when you've done that and you're asking more questions, you earn the right to then talk about how your product solves that. And by extension, hey, I know I caught you out of the blue. I would love to set up 30 minutes with our team to see if it's a fit and we can really dive into your use case, which sounds like a great fit right out of the gate. So I can include a ton of nuance within those steps, and I've made a lot of videos too about cold calls and beyond. But I think, again, it's not realistic to watch one video and think that you're gonna have the answer or see one thing and suddenly have it in place, right? But if you're timid about making cold calls in the first place, that's your job. You got to accept that. And whatever you got to do to just get in that mindset, like we need to accept that and move on, right? And now when you get people on the call, you've got to understand, especially early, you have no sales experience like I did when I started, you're going to struggle. And the way to combat that is educating yourself more and more about any way the conversation could go. And thus, a logical place to start, again, is with the product. As you know the product, you start to have better conversations. Again, you probably missed the mark a few times because you pitched too soon. Now you start to learn how to ask better questions because you've got enough repetition to see how prospects are reacting to the things that you're saying, to see what kinds of questions they really respond to the most, right? And this is better informing your call with each mistake you make. And it's just a part of the process. It's unavoidable to make these mistakes. But again, as you struggle through that and you really take a step back and really go into each call with intention, understanding where you have to get to, you almost, without writing it out on paper or making a formal block chart, whatever it might be, you really have almost a script in your mind and you have the ability to quickly jump from one or two or three different ways that you could guide a conversation that make you sound much more natural as opposed to being salesy. But I'll tell you again, this isn't just relevant to B2B tech sales. Even now, when I'm making videos, there's times where I really try my best to avoid being like that, hey, like and subscribe and hit that notification bell and all that stuff. That still just feels weird and inauthentic and inorganic and kind of salesy to me, to be honest with you. But that being said, I've helped a lot of people break into tech sales. And for the longest time, I was even too timid about plugging the course that I've built with numerous other sales reps in industry that have helped a lot of people break into tech sales. I certainly understand that not everyone watching this video is trying to break into tech sales and needs it. But again, when you're coming from that place that you realize that sales is a necessary part of business, no one is going to buy unless you ask, You have to get comfortable with asking. Again, if you're interested in breaking into tech sales, feel free to check out our free lesson in the description below. So again, whether you're an entrepreneur, starting a channel, whether you're in B2B sales, whatever it might be, I hope those 4 steps really give you an idea of how to progress your career and keep stress testing that as much as possible. Get actual experience and map it to that. Don't get caught up reading books if you haven't even made, 100 or 1,000 cold calls in your life. Just get that experience first. Then you're quickly able to iterate, quickly able to understand why you failed, and just be objective about it as to take any of it personally. So I hope that helps. If you're in sales, if you're looking to break into sales, let me know your own experience. Have you struggled with this yourself? I'd love to make a follow-up video if this is something that really caught your attention. But again, appreciate your time, and we'll see you next week.